February 14, 1945. A U.S. Navy destroyer secretly sails in the Suez Canal, carrying Franklin D. Roosevelt and a team of delegates. He only has a few weeks to live and his blood pressure is a mind-boggling 260/40. Yet, he is determined for this. He thinks this will be his legacy, and it will make America the next superpower. He was right. This would be remembered as one of the most important days in history, and a new world order was about to be created. So, why was he there? To meet the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, and convince him to sell Saudi oil exclusively in US dollars. We will talk about the specifics of how he did it later, but he somehow convinced the king to do this. After this meeting, the US has made one strategic move after another and has come to dominate world trade. It has become so powerful that it could make or break a country overnight. Take Russia for example. After it invaded Ukraine, it was cut off from the international markets and its $600 billion worth of reserves overnight. But the US dollar's dominance could be under threat. Just take a look at this graph. US dollar's market share in global trade has reduced from 71% in 1999 to less than 59% today. New players like China have emerged and they are trying to make their mark on the global stage. The US has weaponized dollars for far too long, and others don't like it. Even Saudi Arabia is in talks to sell its oil in other currencies soon. So, how did the dollar get so powerful in the first place and how could that change soon? In this video, we are taking a deep dive into the insane story of the dollar. But before we do that, give that like button a gentle tap. Alright, let's get started. The US dollar's power cannot be explained by a single event like Saudi Arabia agreeing to sell their oil exclusively in dollars. It was decades in the making before this meeting, and decades of strategic moves after this. So we need to start during the First World War. Both world wars were primarily fought in European countries. Sure, the US took part in the war later, but it initially sold weapons, and it profited massively during both world wars. While Europe was busy dedicating all its resources to the war, the US had been increasing its production capacity and exports rapidly. The total value of US exports grew from just $2.4 billion in 1913 to $6.2 billion in 1917. The same thing happened in World War II. It first became a war merchant and only joined the war after Pearl Harbor. And even after this, the war was never fought on US soil. So you see, while the US was not hit hard by both wars and its infrastructures remained virtually intact, Europe was devastated. Their factories were bombed, young people were killed, and government debt was soaring. Germany suffered hyperinflation after World War I, and countries like the UK and France were drowning in debt. After World War II, European economies were so bad that other countries simply didn't want to trade with them in their currencies. This is where the US saw a massive opportunity. You see, the US had been anticipating this and buying up gold like crazy. You will understand why in a minute, but it had bought so much that during this time, it owned almost 75% of the world's gold supply. So in 1944, the US called a meeting of 44 countries and pitched a proposal, the Bretton Woods Agreement. The idea was simple. The US dollars would be backed by gold and currencies of these 44 countries would be pegged to the US dollar. So in effect, these countries' currencies would be pegged to gold. This was very convenient for everyone. If, let's say, France didn't trust the UK, it did not matter. The pound was backed by US dollar, which was backed by gold. So, France could trade with the UK easily if it trusted the US, and it was the most beneficial for the US. All of a sudden, the US was at the center of world trade and its currency was being used as a reserve by everyone. While this was happening, the US was also playing another angle. You see, after the two world wars, the world realized oil was the commodity of the future, and whoever controls oil will control the world in the coming decades. At this time, the only companies capable of oil exploration and extraction were the US and European companies. In 1938, two American companies, Chevron and Texaco, discovered something huge in Saudi Arabia. the world's largest oil reserve. At this time, Saudi Arabia and most of the Middle East were a vast desert with poverty everywhere. So, when this oil well was discovered, everything changed. Saudi Arabia overnight becomes a very important place and everyone wanted a piece of the pie. US companies and the military started settling bases in the country and Saudi Arabia was suddenly rich. While this was true, Middle East was still a very underdeveloped place and clans were fighting for control of lands all the time. On top of that, Italy started to bomb the US bases and oil wells during the World War II. So, Saudi Arabia desperately wanted security. This is where FDR saw the biggest opportunity of his life. So, even though he was very sick, he decided to go to this meeting. It was clear that Saudi Arabia was going to be the biggest player in the oil industry, and if the US could bring Saudi Arabia to its side, it would change the world order. So on February 14, 1945, he secretly arranged a meeting with the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. It had to be secret because America had agreed not to interfere with British territories. It was set under pretext of talking about getting refuge to 10,000 Jews in Palestine, but FDR was clear in his head. He had to convince the king to sell oil in US dollars. The two people were so different from each other. FDR was a champion of democracy and freedom, while the king was an absolute totalitarian who had fought in many wars and brought slaves to the meeting. Remember this difference for later. After hours of negotiation, FDR finally convinced the king. The US would protect Saudi Arabia by establishing military bases and selling advanced weapons. In return, Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in dollars. Later, Saudi Arabia also convinced all OPEC countries to sell oil in US dollars. To understand just how big this was, think of currencies as normal goods and services. If more people need it, the demand increases. Now, everyone in the world needed US dollars to buy oil, which was the most important commodity in the world. So, the demand for US dollars increased rapidly and everyone started holding reserves in US dollars. This was working well till the 1960s. By the end of the 60s, the US economy was not doing so well. A long Vietnam War, high interest rates and stagflation had crushed the US economy. Its gold reserves had also depleted to just 10,000 tons in 1970 from 22,000 tons in 1940. The reserves had become so low, they could not afford to keep exchanging gold for US dollars. Forex speculators saw this and started to bet against the US dollar. The situation got so bad that Richard Nixon announced a temporary halt to the convertibility of the dollar to gold. The Bretton Woods system completely collapsed after this. You would think that people lost trust in the US dollar after this, but no. Why? You see, even though the US dollar was pegged from gold, it was still the best option. It was the largest and most stable economy in the world, and most of all, you needed it to buy oil. So most countries just held on to their dollars, and it quickly became even more powerful. Now, the US dollar was not backed by gold or any other tangible assets, but by the belief that the US would be stable. Not as safe, but still the best bet for everyone. These factors would allow the US to create its third and most important weapon for domination, the SWIFT system. The US created a system for international trade where it would be involved no matter who is selling to whom. You see, in the modern world, if you buy or sell anything internationally, the US is involved in it. Let's say you are from the Philippines and you want to buy $10 million worth of cement from Australia. Here's how the system works. You contact your local bank to make the payment. The local bank has an American bank, and the seller's bank also has an account with an American bank. When you ask your local bank to make the payment, it sends money in US dollars to the seller's bank. The seller's bank confirms it received the money, and the seller sends the cement. Just imagine how much the demand for dollars increased thanks to this. No matter where you are in the world, you need dollars if you want to trade internationally. If it decides to cut off any country in the world from international trade, it can simply instruct its banks to do so, and overnight, they are cut off. This is what the US did to Russia after it invaded Ukraine. So, if the US dollar is so powerful and influential, what's happening these days? How did its market share go from 71% to 59% in just 20 years? You see, the US has been weaponizing the dollar and SWIFT system too much. One of the main reasons everyone wants to keep their money in US dollars is because of its safety and stability. But America has been taking advantage of this by freezing the reserves of a lot of countries lately. It has imposed sanctions on a lot of countries like Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, and most recently, Russia. These countries have completely been cut off from the SWIFT system and their economies are crippling. And this is where the biggest threat to the US dollar lies. A superpower like China has big ambitions and doesn't like being told what to do by Uncle Sam. China has been quietly making a master plan to make Yuan more dominant, and the Russian sanctions have only accelerated this. You see, Russia is already the most sanctioned country in the world, and China could be next if it invades Taiwan. So China wants to be independent of the dollar as soon as possible. Now, both of these countries hold huge leverage over the world. Russia is one of the largest exporters of natural gas and oil, and China is a manufacturing hub of the world. Russia has already started selling its oil in ruble. So, Europe is being forced to buy rubles instead of dollars. If you remember the SWIFT system, now the European countries have to hold ruble with Russian banks instead of dollars with American banks. Countries like India and China have already started to buy oil in ruble, and other Asian countries are following. And if you look at the US dollars held by Russia, they have been preparing to get rid of it since 2014. China also has its leverage with the world, leverage it spent decades building. China has lent out hundreds of billions to 164 countries in a project called the Belt and Road Initiative, also known as BRI. It is a huge infrastructure project, and China aims to build a major trading route all across Asia and Africa. In their words, a modern world Silk Road. However, it follows the same strategy followed by the West and gives out very generous loans to underdeveloped countries. These loans are to fund projects that most of the time don't pay off anything, and the government is left with paying back this massive loan. Countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan have already seen chaos unfold in their country when they were unable to make debt payments. Now, since China has so much leverage against these countries, experts believe China will now ask these countries to take and pay back the loans in yuan instead of US dollars. Even if China lowers their interest rates by 1 to 2% as an incentive, these countries will happily take it. So, all of a sudden, a lot of international debt will now be issued in yuan instead of dollars. And China is already starting to do this. 14% of all the BRI debt is issued in yuan, and Pakistan Central has agreed to conduct all trade with China in yuan. However, the biggest threat to the US dollar is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia controls OPEC, which is like a cartel of the biggest oil producers in the world. They control the flow of oil in the world and control most of its supply. And Saudi Arabia is its de facto leader. If you understood the history of the US dollar, you know Saudi Arabia's agreement to sell in dollars has always been the biggest factor in its dominance. If Saudi Arabia decides not to do so, it will cause the US dollar to lose a lot of demand, and it's looking more and more likely. As I said earlier in the video, Saudi Arabia and America are completely different. One advocates for freedom and democracy, while the other is a totalitarian state. The US-Saudi relationship has always been rocky. OPEC sanctioned the US in 1975 when it decided to supply Israel with military weapons. A lot of people there simply don't like America, and Saudi nationals have been known to support extreme terrorist organizations against the US. The relationship has been bitter ever since journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was critical of the Saudi regime, was assassinated. The reputation of Saudi Arabia took a hit, and President Joe Biden talked against this too. Now, when you are a totalitarian government, you hate this. So, what do? Find alternatives, of course, and Saudi Arabia has been doing just that. It has already agreed to sell oil to China in yuan and is in talks to join BRICS, an organization created by emerging countries of the world which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS is also planning to create a global currency like the euro. If Saudi Arabia along with OPEC countries and Russia started selling oil in this currency, and China and India asked to be paid in this, we could see a currency that could challenge the US dollar. There are also talks to build an alternative to SWIFT, and China and Russia have already built a similar payment network. So, we will have to see what BRICS does. So it is clear that countries are trying to be independent of the dollar. But the dollar isn't going anywhere soon. International trade is still dominated by it, and there is no country as stable and as safe as the US dollar. Sure, China is emerging as a major competitor, but China is not very transparent and is much more authoritarian than America. China also has a much stricter foreign exchange controls. Russia has been a declining power since the Cold War, and its economy is crippling right now. So although countries are trying, the US dollar is still very dominant, and it would take years and major events like in history for there to be a viable replacement for the dollar. So what do you think? Can China push its currency for world trade, or is there someone else? Comment that down below and don't forget to like the video. I will see you in the next video.